We're just a couple of weeks away from the 2025 NFL Draft. Let's break down some of the best and some of the worst options the Jets have with the 7th overall pick today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, April 4th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today's episode is brought to you by the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay tuned for the Armada Player of the Week later in the show. On today's show, we're going to focus on the NFL Draft, which is just about 3 weeks away. The Jets own the 7th overall pick, and we're going to ponder some of the possibilities today. Occasionally on the podcast, I go through some recent mock drafts, and I think that it's a good thought exercise because, first of all, it shows you the players who will be available, or who at least we can plan on being available when the Jets select at 7th overall. And we can also kind of look at some of the scenarios. There are lots of different scenarios that could play out in terms of who the top 6 teams could pick. And depending on who goes in the top 6, the Jets plan could change. So it gives us a chance to kind of look at various scenarios and see how the Jets plan may change depending on what happens in front of them. So the first mock draft I wanted to look at was by Field Yates of ESPN. And Yates has the Jets picking Armand Membou out of Missouri. He's a tackle, 7th overall. Now, the first 6 players chosen are Cam Ward, the quarterback out of Miami, Abdul Carter, the edge rusher from Penn State, Shedeur Sanders, the quarterback from Colorado, Travis Hunter, the wide receiver and corner from Colorado, Mason Graham, the defensive tackle from Michigan, and Ashton Jeanty, the running back from Boise State. So this is interesting on a couple of levels. First of all, according to Field Yates, according to Field Yates' mock draft, the Jets would pass on the wide receiver Ted McMillan, who's currently viewed as the top receiving prospect in the draft. The other interesting part of this is that the Jets would pick Membou over Will Campbell, the tackle prospect out of LSU, who is widely viewed as the top tackle prospect in the draft. Now, of course, that doesn't mean a whole lot. I mean, there have been plenty of instances in the past where a guy's been a consensus top player at his position, and the second or third guy has ended up having a better career. I mean, you could go back. One example that really stands out in my mind is 2014, when Jadeveon Clowney was supposed to be the transcendent talent, and Khalil Mack was supposed to be behind him. And Khalil Mack ended up having a better career than Jadeveon Clowney. Khalil Mack ended up being the transcendent talent, and Jadeveon Clowney ended up just being a good player. You could say the same thing when, that year at the wide receiver position, Sammy Watkins was the consensus top wide receiver. And behind him were guys like Odell Beckham Jr. and Mike Evans. Sammy Watkins was a decent player, dealt with injuries, but the guys drafted behind him ended up being better. So, of course, that could happen. In this scenario, Membou would actually be the first tackle off the board over the guy who generally has been the consensus top tackle in Will Campbell. If this was me, I mentioned this on a show earlier this week, I would lean towards McMillan. I do have some concerns with Membou. I think if you look at his, look at his play to dates, there's a lot of potential there, but there's also a lot of inconsistency. I think, especially the way he utilizes his hands. I think many instances his hand placement is kind of inconsistent. I think there are moments where he leans. I think there's moments where, he doesn't time his, hitting the guy with his hands perfectly. And look, I acknowledge that sounds like a nitpick, and I hate it when analysts overanalyze these prospects. But I think a lot of Membou's concerns are basic fundamental stuff at the tackle position. And I think when you're in college, sometimes you're just so much physically better than the other guy, because you have to remember there are over 100 teams in college football. So, you just may be way better than somebody else. There are only 32 teams in the NFL with 53-man rosters. So even the worst player in the NFL was one of the top players in college. The pool of talent is much smaller, which means you got to use good technique in the NFL. Now, that said, Membou, he's only going to be 21 during his rookie season, and there's potential here. And, one of the things I've been discussing on the show, if you're an everydayer, you've heard me mention this, is I think Brandon Stevens, the corner the Jets signed, is kind of a referendum on Aaron Glenn and Darren Mucci. Now, of course, that's not the only thing. Brandon Stevens' success is not the only thing that will determine whether Glenn and Mucci are successful here. But I think there are a handful of moves that you make that kind of give you a hint as to whether or not you have a good head coach GM, whether those guys are working together, finding the right types of players. And a guy the Jets kind of went out on a limb for in Brandon Stevens is one of those types of guys, because, Jets gave him a lucrative contract relative to what he's done in the past. Jets are essentially projecting that we can make this guy better. Why am I mentioning Brandon Stevens right now? Because I think Membou would be that type of pick for your offensive line coach, because there's potential there. And I think your offensive, if you're making this pick, it's showing you have a lot of confidence in your offensive line coach, and your offensive line coach is telling you, I can develop this guy. One of my concerns with Membou is, you look across the NFL, and there are lots of guys who are on the offensive line who are better on their second contract than they are on their first contract. And that's because offensive line fundamentals are not really taught at a high level anymore in college football. This goes a lot to the schemes that are in college football, and it also goes to the rules that are in college football. A lot of schemes in college football are heavily based on the screen game. There's not as much drop back passing in the college game. There's a lot more screen passes, and there's a reason for that. The rules in college football are different. In college football, you can go down the field 3 yards as an offensive lineman before you get called as an ineligible receiver downfield and get penalized. In the NFL, you can only go 1 yard. So if you can go 3 yards down the field as an offensive lineman, that obviously opens up a lot more in the screen game. And as a result, I think some of the training college linemen to adjust to the NFL has kind of gone out the window, because college schemes don't need to run the drop back passing game as much, which means, first of all, it's not coached, pass blocking and true pass sets is not coached as much, but also, you don't get as many reps just, dropping into pass blocking and dropping into natural pass blocking. So you see across the league, there are guys who really struggle right off the bat on the offensive line. And you even see even guys who are drafted highly, there's an adjustment period for them. And there are lots of guys who, it takes a couple of years for it to click. I worry that Membou might be that type of guy. But a lot of this goes back to your offensive line coach and how much he's capable of. And here's what I will say for Membou. He played at a really high level in the SEC, which obviously is one of the top 2 conferences in college football. It was only 20 years old. And I think age matters when we talk about prospects. It's not because, sometimes the Jets will draft a guy who's in his mid-20s, and I'll mention that, he's an older prospect, and people will say, well, who cares about that? What difference does it make what age you draft him at? You can draft an old prospect who ends up being good, but I do think age matters from the standpoint that a guy who's 20 years old and is holding up against 21, 22, 23, 24-year-olds, that's a good sign, because he's got more runway to grow. He's got a longer time to develop. I mean, I even use the same concept, thinking about high school. If there was a guy who was a freshman on the varsity team who played at a really high level, and then there was a senior who played at a really high level, and the two were playing at a roughly equal level, which of the two would you bet on to end up being a better player? You bet on the freshman, because the freshman's holding up against older players. He's got more time to physically develop. So the fact Membou was playing at a high level in the SEC at 20 years old, that's a very positive sign. So, this would be a pick that I don't know exactly how I'd feel about. I think that there would be some good and some bad. And I think I'd be maybe sitting on the fence a little bit on this pick. I think you could see the potential here. I think you could also kind of see some of the danger signs. So this would be, I think Membou is a guy who's generating a lot of buzz. He's been a guy who's kind of been one of the classic risers after the games ended. And that always concerns me a little bit. But a guy who played at a very, very high level in college, a guy who has some stuff to clean up. But as we know, the Jets do really have a need at the right tackle spot. I mean, he would probably be a guy who would step into the starting lineup right away. Would he be ready for it? I think that's an open question. But obviously a guy who's very much on the table when the Jets pick at 7. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to another mock draft that plays out a scenario that I'm not in love with. And it's not about the player. It's about the position. I'll explain it all in detail as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. The Armada Player of the Week is brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Each week, we're taking a look at draft prospects to pick one guy that stands apart, the guy we believe showcased the power and strength to push the Jets forward as we look forward to next season. This week's Armada and clear-cut Player of the Week is Mason Graham out of Michigan. Mason Graham is a prospect I really like. He's actually not one of the prospects we're mentioning on today's show, but a really rugged guy, a guy who was very stout in the middle of Michigan's defensive line. I think if the Jets drafted him, he'd pair great next to Quinnen Williams. He'd conquer everything with capability and confidence. And when it comes to the Nissan Armada, they say go forth and conquer. And that's exactly what I think Mason Graham can do here. It's clear that our player of the week is ready to conquer the road ahead with confidence, just like you can in the all-new Nissan Armada or any of their outstanding vehicles. Take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Continuing our look through mock drafts today to try and figure out what scenarios could play out for the New York Jets and which prospects could be on their radar as they pick 7th overall. The next mock draft I wanted to look at was from Pro Football Focus, Dalton Wasserman. And I have to be honest with you, this is my least favorite projection to the New York Jets. It would be, so this PFF mock has the Jets drafting Tyler Warren, the tight end out of Penn State. And I know it's a controversial statement. I would really have issues with this pick for a number of reasons. So first of all, let's go through who's off the board in this mock. The first pick is Cam Ward, the quarterback out of Miami. The second pick is Abdul Carter out of Penn State. The third pick is Shedeur Sanders. So 2 quarterbacks out of the first 3 picks. Number 4 is Travis Hunter, the Heisman Trophy winner. Number 5 is Mason Graham out of Michigan. And number 6 is Tet McMillan. So again, both the top 2 tackles would be available, Membou and Campbell. And I think I would go with one of those 2. I think that drafting Tyler Warren, I know some people are going to push back on this. That to me would be reaching for a need without really thinking through the impact, because there simply are not many impact tight ends in the NFL. And a year ago, I was very skeptical of the idea of drafting Brock Bowers. And if you go back through those podcasts, I always stated that I thought Brock Bowers was a really good prospect. My concern was that it's difficult to project the difference between good and great in the NFL. And if you look last year, there were 21 wide receivers who had a 1,000-yard season. There were only 3 tight ends. And the analogy I always use is if there's a wide receiver out there that you think is going to be Justin Jefferson, and he only turns out to be Garrett Wilson, that's well worth the 10th overall pick. But if you draft a tight end that you think is going to be Travis Kelce, and he only turns out to be, I don't know, I can't even think of a good example. If he only turns out to be like Tyler Conklin or something, that's not somebody you should pick in the top 10. And another issue is one of the advantages of having a top 10 pick is that, the rookie wage scale exists, which means you're typically paying if you do it right, if you draft the right player, you're paying him far less than a player of similar caliber on the open market. The Jets right now, their draft slot 7th overall, they will pay whatever player they pick, no matter his position, around just under $7 million a year for the first 4 years of his career. Now, that's a big savings at, say, the wide receiver position. The wide receiver position, the 10th highest paid player is making $28 million per year. So if you draft a wide receiver, let's say you draft Tet McMillan, even though I know he's not on the board in this scenario, but say you draft Tet McMillan, he's only going to make a little less than $7 million a year, not even $7 million a year. Top 10 receivers making $28 million a year. You draft Tyler Warren, well, a top 10 wide receiver, a top 10 tight end in this league is making around $11 million a year. So yeah, there's savings, but there's nowhere near as great. So I have major concerns about this pick. And here's the other aspect of this is yes, if Tyler Warren is as good as Brock Bowers, then he's absolutely worth the pick. Brock Bowers, absolutely, in retrospect, if the Jets had drafted him 10th overall last year, and let's assume we throw out the stuff about whether Nathaniel Hackett knows how to use him or whether Aaron Rodgers is going to ignore him because he's a rookie. Let's presume that Bowers is going to have a similar type season. Bowers absolutely would have been worth the pick. But if Bowers was just okay, if he was just a pretty decent tight end, he wouldn't be worth the pick. Again, if he was Tyler Conklin, he really wouldn't be worth that type of pick. And Tyler Warren, if you're just looking objectively, is not as good as Bowers. And I think there are a couple things at play here. Number one, I think that people are going to look at what Bowers did last year and think that they're finding a similar type of player, a similar type of prospect. I do think Tyler Warren's a good prospect. There's a point in the draft where I would take him, but you can't compare him to Bowers. Bowers stepped on the field. He was in his teens at Georgia and was playing at a super high level. Tyler Warren did not produce at Penn State until his 5th year, when he was already 22 years old. I mean, he had 5 receptions in 2021, 10 receptions in 2022, 34 receptions in 2023, under 1,000 yards receiving his first 4 years in college. Then finally in year 5, and he only played 2 games in 2020, did not have a reception. So those are the 4 years through 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, very minimal impact. 2024 was his breakout season. 104 receptions, 1,233 yards, and 8 touchdowns. That was a great year, and it put him on the map. And he rightly is a prospect teams are looking into, but that's different from saying like he's worth the 7th overall pick. That's different from saying I would bet the 7th overall pick on him. I think that that's an awfully tough thing to do for a guy. And I'll go back to, this is kind of the inverse of what I mentioned in the first segment with Membou. Membou, when at 20 years old, was holding up at a really high level in the SEC, playing the tackle position. Tyler Warren, it took him until he was like the oldest guy on the field to dominate. And look, that could translate to the NFL, but you have to remember, when he was 20 going up against older guys, he wasn't dominating. At best, his 4th year in college, he was looking like a solid tight end, but he wasn't the best guy on the field. I think the other aspect with Warren is Penn State moved him around a lot. He lined up at tight end. He split out wide and receiver. They put him in the slot. He played some wildcat quarterback. He even caught a touchdown pass while he was on a play where he lined up at center. And they ran a weird formation. So he actually snapped the ball and then caught a touchdown pass on the same play in the game against USC. And I think that's the type of thing that leads to a prospect maybe being a little overhyped, because it's great that he stood in a lot of different spots, pre-snap, but that does not inherently make him a superior prospect. The fact he ran a little gadget play where he lined up at center and then caught a touchdown pass at the end of the play, that's a cool play, but does that really improve his stock as a prospect? I think in some people's eyes it does. I don't think it necessarily should, though. I don't want to I feel like maybe I'm being a little too critical here, because I don't want to act like Tyler Warren is a bad prospect. He could be a good prospect, but I have to be consistent here, because I don't think anything I said about Brock Bowers was wrong last year. I just felt like, if you look at what you knew at the time, that would not be the bet I'd take. But Bowers was a clearly superior prospect. So if I was going to say all that stuff about Brock Bowers a year ago, and now we have a prospect who's not as good as Bowers, and is probably less likely to be that dominant just based on what he did in his first couple of years in college, I find that to be a tough pick. And I know a lot of people like Tyler Warren. I know it would be a popular pick in some quarters, but I almost feel like this is like looking at the Jets tight end position and coming to the conclusion it's the weakest position on the team, which it might be, because right now you have Jeremy Ruckert as the starter, and Ruckert has not really shown any ability, any signs that he could play at a capable level, even as a number 2 or number 3 tight end. But I don't think that means you just go draft Tyler Warren. I think if that's what the board is, you take the tackle. You take one of the top 2 tackles, whichever one you like better, and you move forward with them and try and build this offensive line out. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we just, obviously we just got through my nightmare scenario. Let's turn to my dream scenario. I really doubt the board's going to fall like the next scenario we're going to play out, but I would be really delighted. Probably my favorite prospect in the draft potentially falling to the Jets. And you have to be ready, because sometimes there are surprises in the draft. I really hope this surprise plays out. I'll tell you what it is as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Friday. We're going through a couple of potential draft day scenarios for the New York Jets on today's episode. Let's turn our attention now to a mock draft that Maurice Jones-Drew did on NFL.com. And I have to be honest with you, I think the odds of things playing out this way are very small. But I feel like every year in the NFL draft, there's some sort of shock or some sort of scenario that comes out of left field that nobody sees. So you always have to be ready to be surprised on draft day. I mean, There are the obvious things like, the Laramie Tunsil situation from a few years back, and I'm not going to go through it. If you're not familiar with what happened with Laramie Tunsil, the NFL draft when he was selected, you can Google it and look it up. But every year there are guys who fall out of nowhere. There are surprise picks. So Maurice Jones-Drew has the Jets picking the Heisman Trophy winner Travis Hunter, and I don't know where he gets Travis Hunter falling to 7. Let's go through the first 6 picks. Cam Ward, number 1. Abdul Carter, number 2. Shador Sanders, number 3. Will Campbell, the tackle out of LSU, number 4. Ted McMillan, the receiver out of Arizona, number 5. And Ashton Jeanty, the running back out of Boise State, number 6. And it seems like there's an increasing buzz for Jeanty going high in the first round, potentially top 10, which would be unusual from the running back position. So that would leave Travis Hunter available when the Jets pick. And to me, that's a situation where you just run up to the podium with the card, because I don't think that there is, in recent memory, I don't think there's been a player who's a non-quarterback who could potentially add more value, because Travis Hunter plays both corner and wide receiver. And I think that the analysis of Travis Hunter across, NFL circles has shown a real lack of humility, because people have arbitrarily decided what he's capable of doing and not capable of doing in the NFL. A lot of people have already decided he can only play on one side of the ball. And maybe that's true, but I don't know why we're making that judgment yet. And I think part of it's just conventional wisdom in the NFL, because nobody plays on both sides anymore. If you go back decades and decades, there were guys who played both, guys who never came off the field. Originally guys played offense and defense the whole game. And there really weren't many substitutions, if any substitutions. And then, eventually as the league progressed, we grew into an era of 2 platoon football where you have offensive specialists and defensive specialists. But in college, it's been a long time since there's been a guy who was a prospect rated this highly who actually played full time on both sides of the ball. Occasionally you'll see a guy who's being converted, like a quarterback being converted to wide receiver or something, or sometimes there's like a defensive tackle prospect who isn't much of a defensive tackle prospect, but somebody gets the idea maybe we can move into the offensive line. This is a guy who actually played both sides of the ball, and he played both sides of the ball at a very high level. Now, I'm not saying he can play both sides of the ball full time in the NFL, because I do think that would be a challenge. But are there scenarios where maybe he's a corner full time and he's your number 4 receiver, and maybe in big games you up his snap counts at the receiver position? I think potentially. Is it? And here's the other aspect of this. Let's just say hypothetically that the cynics are right, that he can only play one position, and maybe they are. Let's think this through. Travis Hunter was a guy who won the Fred Biletnikoff Award. If you're not familiar with that, that goes to the best wide receiver in college football. He also won the Chuck Bednarik Award, which goes to the Defensive Player of the Year in college football. So this was a guy who really was splitting his attention between 2 different positions. He wasn't working full time at wide receiver, but he had so much natural ability that he still won the award for best receiver. And he wasn't playing corner full time. He was kind of dividing his attention between that and wide receiver, but he still played corner at a high enough level that he was the Defensive Player of the Year in college football. So let's talk about a scenario where Travis Hunter only plays one side of the ball. Once he starts dedicating himself fully to one position, when he starts giving his full attention, where he practices there full time, where he's working exclusively on the technique at that one position, don't you think he's going to improve? Don't you think he can be better? And he was already the best in college football, dividing his attention. And this is where, I just think there's so much upside here. I don't think there's ever been in recent memory a non-quarterback who could potentially add more value to a football team, because I think you have to have an open mind about this. I think when you draft Travis Hunter, you see what he can do. I think you give him you put the most on his plate possible. You start out seeing how much can he play at corner, how much can he play at wide receiver. And you have to be careful, because you don't want him to get fatigued. You don't want him to wear down. The rookie wall is a real thing. Guys in the NFL tend to wear down their rookie year in December. And if you give a guy, if you really run Travis Hunter into the ground his rookie year, you have the potential for that to come even earlier. And you also have to be worried about the injury factor, because if a guy's fatigued, he's more likely to be injured. If you put a guy out there the full game, the odds are higher he's going to be fatigued. The NFL is more physically demanding than college football. There's no question about that. And I think these concerns are valid concerns. What I don't think these do is I don't think these definitively prove what Travis Hunter can or can't do. And again, even if even when we get into a scenario where he's the number one corner and number 4 receiver, or vice versa, where he's the number 1 receiver and he plays in sub packages and then plays high leverage snaps at the corner position, that's an incredible amount of value. It's essentially the value of 2 players in one. And the cynic says, well, if he gets injured, he plays both sides of the ball and gets injured, now you're down 2 players. Well, I guess that's true, but you also have to remember that if he doesn't, when he's not injured, he's essentially filling 2 roles for the price of 1 guy. That's pretty good, isn't it? Isn't that what you want? So it's like, you can look at it as glasses half empty, that, if he gets injured, we're in trouble. But you can look at the glasses half full, as that, the plan's not for him to be injured. And again, even in a world where the cynics are right and he can only play one side of the ball full time, I think there's a lot of upside there. I think there's a tremendous amount, and he's already starting in a spot where, again, he was an elite level player, not focusing on either position full time, not focusing on developing his technique at either spot, not focusing on the film study at either spot. If he can improve, if we can increase that, I think the sky's the limit. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.